We live in a non-algorithmic universe at its core.
The first time anyone said out loud that the universe was definitively not a simulation, the news article came with a stock photo of pixels falling off a galaxy. Nia Santos scrolled past the picture and squinted at the headline hovering above the cafe table. Consequences of undecidability in physics. New study says universe cannot be a simulation. Bold, she murmured. Across from her, Jonas Wilde, philosopher of science and professional contrarian, looked up from his espresso. Bold is Latin for probably overstated. Faisal, Kraus, Shabir, Marino, Nia read, Journal of Holography Applications in Physics. They use Gödel, Tarski, Chaitin, Lucas Penrose, the whole undecidability orchestra conclusion. A purely algorithmic theory of everything is impossible, so reality must rely on non-algorithmic understanding, and therefore simulation hypothesis loses. She hated how clean that sounded. Jonas leaned forward, dark hair falling into his eyes. Wait, they explicitly say simulation hypothesis is dead? She scrolled. Yeah, right here, because any simulation is algorithmic and reality's foundation isn't. The universe cannot be a simulation, period. Jonas whistled. So the Matrix fandom is in mourning. At the next table, someone snorted. Nia didn't have to turn to know who it was. You're both reading the press write-up, said a new voice. You want the actual letter. Meikwan dropped her tray onto their table, almost tipping Jonas's espresso into his lap. Her hair was in its usual messy knot, pen stuck in it like an afterthought, eyes bright behind round glasses. Nia tilted her tablet up. You already downloaded it? Of course. May slid into the empty chair without asking. Paper's only 11 pages. The abstract is basically a declaration of war on algorithmic physics. War is Latin for grant money, Jonas said. May ignored him and tapped the tablet, bringing up the PDF Nia had cued earlier. The title glared back. Consequences of Undecidability in Physics on the Theory of Everything. I skimmed the arXiv version last night, May said. They formalize quantum gravity as a first-order axiomatic system, FQG. Assume it's computable and then hit it with Gödel, Tarski, and Chaitin like a truck. And wham, Jonas said. No computable theory of everything. Nia read aloud, half to herself. They argue that some physical facts, like specific black hole microstates, will be true but unprovable in any such system, and that you need non-algorithmic understanding to access them. Then they cash that out into a meta-theory of everything that lives beyond computation. May sipped her coffee. And then they jump to, since any computer simulation is algorithmic, the universe can't be one. Don't sound so offended, Jonas said. You're the logician. Shouldn't you be thrilled Gödel's getting another victory lap? It's not Gödel I'm worried about, May said. It's the leap from no complete algorithmic description from inside to no algorithmic generator from outside. Nia looked up. Explain. May tapped the table with her pen. Gödel says, for any sufficiently rich, computable formal system, there are true sentences it can't prove. That's about descriptions, theories. It doesn't say anything directly about structures, the worlds those theories might describe. Jonas raised a finger. Objection. The paper treats the fundamental theory itself as the engine that generates space-time. So if the engine is incomplete, the world needs something non-algorithmic to run. That's one way to interpret it, May said. But there's another possibility. They might be conflating no complete internal theory with no external algorithmic generator. She sat back. It smells like a category mistake. Nia closed the PDF. Okay, she said. Forget philosophy for a second. There's a colloquium this afternoon. Faisal is dialing in. Let's ask him. Jonas grinned. You had me at confront the authors. May's eyes were still on the tablet, but her mind was clearly somewhere else. Or, she said quietly, we build an experiment. 1. The letter and the room. By 3 in the afternoon, the main seminar room at the Institute for Quantum Structures was standing room only. Someone had bothered to clean the whiteboards. The coffee urn in the back had not survived the onslaught. Nia sat in the second row, laptop open, half connected to the Institute's quantum computing cluster. May sat to her left with a notebook already half filled with symbols. Jonas had, predictably, arrived late and had to sit cross-legged on the floor by the wall, typing confirmations to students who wanted to know if they were allowed to cite the new paper on their simulation essays. The big screen at the front flickered. The title slide appeared, along with 4 small video windows. Mir Faisal sat in a tidy office, bookshelves behind him stacked with quantum gravity texts. Lawrence Krauss was in a more minimalist room, hands steepled. Arshid Shabir appeared to be in a shared workspace with a whiteboard covered in equations behind him. Francesco Marino's background was a neutral blur. The Institute director, Professor Tariq Al-Masri, took the podium. His beard was going grey, his accent soft from 2 continents. "Welcome, everyone," he said. "You've all read the abstract by now. I'll let Dr. Faisal speak for the team. Mir." Faisal inclined his head. His voice came through crisp. "Thank you, Tariq. As the abstract states, our goal was to analyze what undecidability results from mathematical logic imply for any would-be theory of everything in physics, and to address, perhaps provocatively, the computational simulation of the universe." He gestured, and the slides advanced. Equations, diagrams of spacetime singularities, references to loop quantum gravity, string theory, emergent spacetime scenarios. Naya tried to pay attention, but the core argument was already familiar from the letter. Model quantum gravity as a formal system. FQG equals left parenthesis, LQG, comma, SIGMA, comma, RALG, right parenthesis, FQG equals left parenthesis, LQG, comma, SIGMA, comma, RALG, right parenthesis, FQG equals left parenthesis, LQG, comma, SIGMA, comma, RALG, right parenthesis. Assume FQG is computable. Its axioms and rules can be algorithmically enumerated. By Gödel's first incompleteness theorem, if FQG is consistent and interprets basic arithmetic, there exists a sentence GQG which is true in the intended model but unprovable within FQG. By Gödel's second theorem, FQG cannot prove its own consistency without becoming inconsistent. Tarski's undefinability theorem blocks an internal global truth predicate. Chaitin's incompleteness says that beyond a certain complexity threshold, sentences of high Kolmogorov complexity are undecidable. So, Faisal concluded on that part, any purely algorithmic quantum gravity theory, any attempt to compress physical reality into a computable axiomatic system, will necessarily leave out truths about that reality. A slide titled Meta-Theory of Everything appeared, with a diagram of nested circles. Formal theory, meta-theory, non-algorithmic understanding. Rather than bemoan this as a breakdown of science, we take it as pointing to a hierarchy of description. There must exist a meta-theory, not itself fully computable, which grounds the truths the formal system cannot capture. Science, in this picture, is a dialogue between algorithmic deduction and non-algorithmic understanding. He paused. The next slide bore the words, simulation hypothesis. And what of the idea, popular in both science and culture, he said, that our universe might be a simulation run on some computer in a higher-level reality? Silence in the room thickened. A simulation, by definition, is algorithmic. It is governed by a program, perhaps immensely complex, but still a rule-based procedure. If the very fabric of our universe requires non-algorithmic resources to account for undecidable phenomena, then no purely algorithmic simulator could generate it. Thus, a fully realistic simulation of our universe is impossible. The universe cannot be merely a simulation. He smiled faintly. We appreciate this conclusion may disappoint some. Tariq returned to the podium. Thank you, Mir. We have time for questions. Half the room's hands shot up. Tariq pointed to a senior theorist, Dr. Klein, who launched into a question about specific models of emergent spacetime. The discussion swirled through technicalities, spin networks, group field theories, connections to previous papers by the same authors. Naya kept her hand down. She wasn't ready to tangle with Krauss on conceptual issues in front of a full room. May, predictably, was not so restrained. "Tariq!" she called from the second row. "May I?" Tariq nodded. "Go ahead, Dr. Kwan." May stood. Her notebook dangled from her hand, open to a page of scribbled formulas. "Thank you for the talk," she began. "I have a question about the inference from incompleteness to non-simulability." Faisal nodded. "Please." You model the candidate TOE as a formal system FQGF sub QG and show correctly that such a system will be incomplete and unable to define its own global truth predicate. Then you say that some physical facts are inherently undecidable by any algorithmic theory, and so a simulation, which is algorithmic, can't capture them. She tilted her head. But that seems to conflate the limitations of internal description with the capabilities of an external generative process. Krauss leaned closer to his webcam. "In what sense?" "Well," May said, "Gödel's theorem is about what can be proven inside a system, but a structure, say the standard model of arithmetic, has all of its truths determined independent of any particular formal system's ability to derive them. One can imagine an algorithm that, given any finite portion of that structure, produces the correct behavior for that portion without computing every arithmetical truth all at once." She glanced at Nia, then back to the screen. "A simulation only ever needs to generate finite configurations," she said. "Finite regions of space-time, finite experimental outcomes. Gödel blocks a complete, recursively axiomatizable theory from within, but why does that forbid an external algorithm from generating, step by step, whatever finite region is needed?" There was a small, almost imperceptible pause on the video call. Arshid spoke first. "Are you suggesting an algorithm that somehow evades the halting problem?" "No," May said. "I'm suggesting an algorithm that never needs to solve it in full generality. It might approximate or defer decisions, or rely on interactions with a larger environment. The point is, incompleteness tells us about the internal proof power of FQG, not necessarily about what a simulator with more resources, or a different perspective, could do." Faisal interjected, "But any such simulator would itself be an algorithmic system. It could be encoded as a formal theory with computable rules. Then the Gödel Tarski Chaitin limitations would apply at that higher level as well. There would be truths, physical or mathematical, beyond its reach. The simulation would fail to capture those." May nodded slowly. "At that higher level, yes. But then you're moving the incompleteness up a level. You're not eliminating the possibility of simulation. You're just saying that no matter what level you're on, your own description is incomplete." Krauss's smile was wry. "Our point is that a single, fully algorithmic theory of everything that captures all physical truths is impossible. A simulator would need such a theory to run a faithful universe." "And my point," May said, "is that maybe it wouldn't. Maybe all it needs is to generate correct outcomes for the finite pieces that ever come into play. Gödel doesn't forbid that. It only forbids compressing all truths into one recursively enumerable package." In the third video window, Marino spoke for the first time. "This may be a matter of emphasis," he said. "We argue that there are physical questions tied to undecidable sentences that no algorithmic deduction from FQG can answer. If those questions correspond to actual experimental possibilities, a simulator, being algorithmic, cannot decide them all in a rule-based way." Nia felt something tighten in her chest. That was the hinge. If undecidable sentences mapped onto genuine experiments. Tariq raised a hand to moderate. "This is an important discussion. Perhaps it can continue in the reading group next week?" There were a few polite laughs. May sat down, cheeks faintly flushed. Nia leaned toward her. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" she whispered. May's eyes never left the screen. "Of course not," she said, "because I think Gödel might be trying to tell us the opposite of what they think." 2. The meta-proposal. The Institute's experimental wing sat in a separate building, all glass and steel and badge readers. The hallway outside Lab 5E smelled faintly of coolant and coffee. Nia waved her badge and stepped into the control room. Machines hummed quietly behind thick glass. Racks of dilution refrigerators, cabling that looked like golden spaghetti, and in the center of it all a compact cryostat holding the Institute's newest quantum processor. On the wall, someone had taped a cartoon, a Turing machine with smoke coming out, captioned, "Halting problem, you are here." Nia grinned. That had been May. She dropped her bag on a chair and woke the control console. The status dashboard blinked online. Qubit coherence times, error rates, job queue. Jonas appeared a few minutes later, still wearing the philosophical uniform of black jeans and a shirt whose slogan read, "Reality, now with 30% more ontology." "Tell me we're about to violate some deep principle," he said, leaning on the back of her chair. "Best case," Nia said, "we violate a prestigious letter in JHAP. Worst case, we waste 3 months of compute time." May arrived with a stack of printouts and a laptop covered in stickers. "Sex for all XX. I love you, trust the category functor," a picture of Gödel looking worried. "This is the final version," she said, handing Jonas the top pages. Working title, Meta-Theoretic Experimental Test of Algorithmicity. Jonas flipped through, humming, "Ah, an acronym. Truly, we are doing science." Nia brought up the proposal document on the main screen. The abstract was intentionally understated. "We propose an experimental program that encodes formal undecidability into physically realizable quantum processes, in order to test whether certain classes of physical questions correspond to algorithmically undecidable propositions. The goal is to clarify the implications of logical incompleteness for physical theory, and in particular, to assess claims that undecidability precludes algorithmic simulation of the universe." Section 2, May said, lays out how we map instances of the halting problem into quantum circuits. "We use something like the Shiraishi-Matsumoto construction for undecidability and quantum thermalization, but tuned to our device." Nia nodded. They'd spent weeks refining that part. For each input, NNN, they would construct a classical Turing machine, TNTN, and an associated quantum process, UNUN, such that if TNT_NTN halts, the system thermalizes to one characteristic pattern. If TNT_NTN does not halt, it evolves toward a different, distinguishable pattern, or fails to thermalize in a controlled way. In practice, it was all about designing Hamiltonians whose long-time dynamics encoded the halting behavior. Section 3, Jonas said, reading, "We define physically undecidable experiments as those where, given the mapping, the corresponding halting question is independent of our chosen formal theory, FFF, or beyond its computable reach." May leaned against the console. "The Faisal letter assumes that there are actual physical observables whose values correspond to Gödel sentences of FQG. We're just following that assumption but giving it operational content." Jonas looked up. "And then what?" "Then we run them," Nia said. "We pick a formal system FFF, say ZFC plus large cardinals, or their proposed quantum gravity axioms, and generate a set of TNTN where it's provable in FFF that they halt, another set where it's provable that they don't, and a third set where the halting question is undecidable in FFF, or at least not resolved within a given proof-theoretic complexity." May chimed in. "Category A, decidable halts. Category B, decidable non-halts. Category C, undecidable or beyond reach in FFF. We encode each category into physical processes and see how the universe handles them." Jonas frowned. "Handles in what sense?" in the sense of producing one outcome or another, May said. If the universe truly corresponds to an algorithmic TOE limited by FFF, you might expect the category C experiments to be genuinely indeterminate or somehow unresolvable. Whereas, Jonas said slowly, if the universe implements a richer meta-theory, it might assign definite outcomes to category C as well. Naya shook her head. That's still mostly conceptual. Our real interest is different. She clicked to the last section of the proposal, implications for simulation hypothesis. We're not claiming we can settle whether we're in a simulation, she said, but we can test something subtler. Does the behavior of these undecidability-encoded experiments support the idea that physical law is running into the same logical walls as FFF or not? May's eyes gleamed. And if not, that's where the loophole lives, because the letter's argument hinges on tying undecidability in formal systems directly to undecidability in physical law. Jonas tapped the printed pages against his palm. This is wildly ambitious, he said, and the chance that we get a clean signal is low, Nia said. Tiny, May said at the same time. Jonas smiled. Excellent, I'll sign. 3. Omega in the machine. Getting funding turned out to be easier than expected. Apparently, the combination of hot topics, quantum computing, undecidability, simulation hypothesis, plus the implicit challenge to a high-profile letter, was irresistible to reviewers bored of incremental proposals. Within 6 weeks, the Meta project had a small budget, time on the Institute's processor, and a shared Slack full of argument threads. By late autumn, they were ready to run the first serious batch. Nia adjusted the job parameters on the console. Test run 17C, she said. Category C instances, proof theoretic height above cutoff. Initial state prepared, decoherence times acceptable May. May double-checked the mapping on her tablet. Each index NN corresponds to a Turing machine TNTN, whose halting problem is either independent of ZFC or at least not settled within ordinal complexity alpha, less than epsilon 0. Within our resource constraints, we have no proof either way. Jonas perched on the edge of a desk, watching. And you've quarantined my philosophical musings from the actual code, he asked. Yes, Jonas, Nia said. No existential quantifiers in the firmware. She hit run. On the display, a set of progress bars inched forward as the processor cycled through the prepared instances. For each NNN, the device evolved the quantum system under Hamiltonian HNH for a fixed time window, then measured an observable designed to distinguish between Holt-like and non-Holt-like behavior. In reality, it was more nuanced than a binary outcome. They got a probability distribution over measurement results from which they inferred a bias. Did the system behave more like the halting archetype or the non-halting one? They let the run go overnight. The next morning, Nia returned with a coffee that should have violated at least one local health regulation. She pulled up the results. A table filled the screen, rows of NNN values, columns of measured biases. A few hours later, May arrived, hair damp from the rain, laptop under her arm. You started without me, she said, mock offended. You were late, Nia said, and I only looked. May slid into the chair next to her. Anything interesting? Nia hesitated. Define interesting, she said. Non-trivial patterns in the Category C data, May said promptly. Unexpected correlations, something we can fight about. Nia highlighted the Category A and B rows first. As expected, she said. For the machines we know halt, the system's observable converges to pattern H with high probability. For the machines we know don't, it leans toward pattern NH some noise, but within error bars. Good, May said. If those had failed, I'd suspect you'd accidentally wired Jonas into the control loop. Jonas, arriving just then with his own coffee, raised an eyebrow. I hear slander. Nia scrolled down. Okay, she said. Category C. The biases for Category C weren't random. That was the first surprise. If the system's behavior was insensitive to the underlying halting question, They'd expect a roughly uniform spread between H and NH behaviors, smeared by noise. Instead, the rows clustered. For some NN, the behavior was nearly indistinguishable from the halting archetype. For others, from the non-halting one, and the pattern wasn't simple. May frowned. "We need to quantify this," she said. "Run algorithmic randomness tests on the sequence of inferred halting-like versus non-halting-like decisions." Jonas blinked. "We're testing the randomness of the universe's answer to undecidable questions." "Roughly," May said. "We want to know if this is compressible by any small program, or if it approximates Martin-Löf randomness. If it's truly uncomputable, that'd be something." Naya already had Python open. "I'll feed it into the usual batteries. NIST tests, Lempel-Ziv complexity estimates, and then your favorite, the approximate Kolmogorov complexity estimator." By the time the sun had shifted across the control room window, they had the first round of analyses. Jonas leaned over Nia's shoulder as graphs appeared. "Okay," Nia said slowly. "This is weird." The binary sequence derived from the category C outcomes, call it SSS, had passed all the standard randomness tests. That wasn't shocking. Quantum systems were good at that. But May's approximate complexity estimates told a stranger story. "The initial segments have algorithmic complexity very close to their length," she said. "Within the margin, it's behaving like a prefix of Chaitin's omega." Jonas straightened. "Omega? As in the halting probability?" "Yeah," May said softly. "The real number you get by summing 2 to the power of negative p over all halting programs p on some universal prefix-free machine. Its binary expansion is algorithmically random. No program significantly shorter than NNN bits can generate its first NNN bits. It encodes solutions to the halting problem in compressed form." Nia stared at the screen. "You're saying," she said, "that the pattern of our category C outcomes looks like the first, few hundred bits of omega?" "Like some omega," May said, "up to machine-dependent constants. But yes, the compressibility profile is exactly what you'd expect from a halting probability." Jonas sat down. "Okay," he said, "so either we've stumbled on the universe's favorite real number, or the mapping we used makes this natural," Naya said. "We're literally feeding halting problems in, but the point of omega is that its bits are not computable by any finite formal system stronger than a trivial one. Yet here they are, falling out of a physical experiment as if the universe is evaluating an uncomputable function." May chewed on the end of her pen. "One way to read this," she said, "is exactly what Faisal et al. Suggest. Physical reality is driven by some non-algorithmic mechanism capable of settling instances of the halting problem. Our experiment just built a crude interface to it." "And the other way?" Jonas asked. May glanced at the quantum processor behind the glass. "The other way," she said, "is that we have just accidentally designed the universe's AP1 to the simulator's halting oracle. 4. 2 interpretations and a loophole." They took 3 days before they told anyone else. Those 3 days were a blur of verification. Nia re-ran the experiments under slightly perturbed conditions. May checked for bugs in their mapping and statistical analysis. Jonas played devil's advocate so aggressively that Nia threatened to unplug his laptop. They ruled out the obvious artifacts: subtle crosstalk between qubits, a stray bias in the measurement apparatus, misseeded pseudo-random generators anywhere in the software stack. They even had an external team at the National Quantum Facility rerun a subset of their Category C instances blind. The results weren't identical, they couldn't be, but the compressibility profile of their outcome sequences was eerily similar. On the 4th day, they sat in Tariq's office. He listened in silence, fingers steepled, as May walked him through the construction and the empirical results. "So," he said eventually, "you've built a physical process whose statistics appear to approximate an algorithmically random sequence of bits. This is not unprecedented." May nodded. "True, but this isn't just any random sequence. It tracks the halting behavior of an infinite family of Turing machines in exactly the way Chaitin's omega does. Given our mapping, bit KKK of the sequence corresponds to some non-trivial function of the halting of a whole class of machines of bounded size. We're compressing quite a lot of halting information, Nia added, into each batch of experiments. Tarek turned to Jonas. And you believe this speaks to the simulation question? Jonas spread his hands. I believe it speaks to the relationship between logical incompleteness and physical law, which is in turn central to the argument that the universe cannot be a simulation. He tapped the table. The phasal letter goes like this. If reality were governed by a purely algorithmic theory of everything, then undecidable statements correspond to physical questions the theory can't answer. Therefore, some aspects of reality are essentially non-algorithmic, and you need non-algorithmic understanding to grasp them. Since any simulation is algorithmic, it can't reproduce those aspects QED. And you disagree, Tariq said. I think, Jonas said carefully, that Gödel's incompleteness theorems, plus our experiment, suggest something more subtle. They show that any internal formal theory we construct is incomplete. But that's equally true whether we're in a simulation or not. It's a fact about self-descriptions, not engines. May leaned forward. In our experiment, she said, the universe appears to assign definite statistical structure to questions that are undecidable in our chosen formalism. That could mean there's a non-algorithmic substrate feeding physical law. But it could also mean that physical law corresponds to a stronger theory, a meta-theory, that we haven't fully formalized and possibly cannot formalize from inside. Which is exactly what Faisal et al. Call a meta-theory of everything, Tariq said. Right, May said. But here's the loophole. They assume that this meta-theory is inherently non-algorithmic, in the strong sense of not being implementable as any sort of computation. Our data doesn't force that. It's also consistent with the meta-theory being algorithmic but inaccessible as a recursively axiomatizable theory from within the universe. Nia pulled up a sketch on her tablet and rotated it so Tariq could see. Think of levels, she said. At level 0, we have some formal system F0, F0, F0 we use to describe physics, standard quantum field theory, general relativity, whatever it's incomplete. At level 1, there's a stronger system, F1, F1, that proves some of the F0, F0, undecidable sentences. It's still computable, but more powerful at level 2. There's F2, F2, underscore F2, F2, and so on. May took over. Gödel tells us there's no ultimate FOF omega fo that captures everything in one computable package, at least not one that can see its own standard model of arithmetic. But it doesn't say the hierarchy doesn't exist. Now, imagine that physical reality, the totality of what happens in our universe, is governed by some effective process that, in a loose sense, corresponds to the union of all these FN for any finite situation. There's some level at which the relevant truths are decided. Tariq nodded slowly. And a simulator? A simulator, Nia said, could be an algorithm that, given the current finite state of the universe and the next finite step it needs to decide, queries the appropriate level FN or approximates it. It never needs to encode the whole union as a single recursively enumerable axiom set. It just needs to handle the finite cases as they arise. Jonas smiled faintly. In other words, we can have an algorithmically generable world whose internal theory of everything is provably incomplete. And that's fine. Incompleteness is a limitation of what agents inside can represent, not necessarily of what the outside engine can compute step by step. And omega? Tariq asked. May folded her hands. In one reading, she said, omega is the universe whispering that it has access to a halting oracle we don't. In another, it's the simulator's random number generator showing through. In either case, it undermines the letter's inference that undecidability rules out simulation. She paused, then added, in fact, one could even argue the opposite. If our internal theories are incomplete in precisely the way Gödel predicts, that's exactly what you'd expect if reality is a model of some stronger formal system we can't fully articulate. That's how simulations look from the inside. Tariq leaned back in his chair, eyes distant. You're suggesting, he said, that Gödel's incompleteness, instead of being evidence against simulation, is a kind of signature of being in a lower-level structure embedded in a richer one. Jonas spread his hands. It's at least compatible. And your experiment gives us a concrete case where physical behavior seems to know answers our formal system can't derive, May said, which is exactly the phenomenon that the letter uses to motivate non-algorithmic understanding. We're just hijacking it for a different narrative. Tariq was silent for a long moment. Write it up, he said finally, carefully. Emphasize the logical distinctions. Don't overclaim, but this will stir things. 5. Glitches. The preprint hit ARXIV under a deliberately dry title, Undecidability, Omega-like Sequences, and the Algorithmic Status of Physical Law. Within a week, their inboxes were on fire. Some correspondents were enthusiastic. At last, someone is taking physical undecidability seriously with concrete experiments. Others were skeptical. Your mapping from halting instances to observables seems heavily engineered. Are you sure you're not just baking Omega in by hand? A few were hostile. This is precisely the kind of sloppy thinking that simulation cultists use to derail serious physics. The Faisal team was silent. The first direct response came not from them, but from an anonymous referee on the journal they'd submitted to, who wrote, "The author's arguments do not, in my view, succeed in overturning the central claims of Faisal et al. However, their experiment is interesting and may be publishable if substantially reframed." Jonas declared that substantially reframed was editorial code for less threatening, which May told him was paranoid. Then the glitches started. Little things at first. A log file from one of their late-night runs ended up corrupted. Only the Category C data, and only in one part of the file. A firmware push from the quantum processor's manufacturer introduced a bug that affected exactly the timing routines Meta relied on. A power fluctuation took out the refrigeration system during a crucial run, even though the building's UPS systems were supposed to handle such events. If I were writing a bad sci-fi novel, Jonas said, staring at the dead processor through the glass as engineers bustled around it, this is the part where I'd suggest the simulator doesn't like us pushing on certain questions. If you were writing a good sci-fi novel, Naya said, you'd consider the base rate of lab screw-ups. May was quiet. Humans are pattern machines, she said, but we should still check if the pattern is real. They ran statistics on the failures. Over the past 4 months, there had been 12 major interruptions of Meta runs. 10 of them had occurred when they were executing Category C instances tied to one particular subclass of Turing machines, those whose associated sentences in the mapping asserted things about the consistency of their own formal system. Self-referential ones, May said, pointing at the table. Experiments encoding statements like, "This theory has no contradictions." Jonas rubbed his forehead. You're telling me that whenever we try to coax the universe into telling us whether its own description is consistent, something breaks. It could be a coincidence, Naya said. Our sample size is small. It could, May agreed, but the probability under a simple null model is about 3%. Low enough to raise an eyebrow, not low enough to shout conspiracy yet. Jonas stared at the numbers. Or, he said slowly, it's how you'd implement a kind of sandbox security. Forbid in-simulation agents from carrying out physical processes that would, if successful, reveal too much about the meta-level that runs them. Nia rolled her eyes. You've been reading too much science fiction again. Have you met me? Jonas said. May didn't smile. Even if we put aside simulation narratives, she said, this is still puzzling. If the universe is underwritten by some meta-theory and our experiments start to physically encode sentences about its consistency, maybe we should expect pathological behavior. Those are precisely the sentences Gödel says are undecidable within the system. Gödel's revenge, Jonas said. Something like that, May said. Nia leaned back. Let's be honest, she said. We can't distinguish we hit hardware interference limits when probing extremely delicate configurations from an external agent is messing with the sandbox. Of course not, Jonas said. But the philosophical point stands, independent of pattern hunting in the bugs. Even without glitches, your loophole still undermines the non-simulation conclusion of the letter. May nodded. Exactly, she said. The glitches are narrative spice. The logic is the main dish. 6. The debate. The conference was in Geneva, in a glass-walled building overlooking the lake, where mountains framed every vista, and the espresso was dangerously good. The session was titled Undecidability and the Limits of Physical Theory. It had been added to the program late after intense behind-the-scenes negotiations that Nia only heard about in fragments. We are not a tabloid, one organizer had reportedly said, but we also cannot ignore a paper that has already been viewed 15,000 times on Arxiv. The room was full. Tariq moderated the session. On stage sat May, representing the Meta team, and, to Nia's mingled excitement and dread, Mir Faisal himself. He looked much the same as on the screen months ago, composed, precise, a slight steel under the courtesy. Tariq opened with brief introductions, then nodded to May. "You have 20 minutes!" May did not bother with a gentle preamble. "Our starting point," she said, "is the argument advanced by Faisal et al. That Gödel's incompleteness theorems, Tarski's undefinability, and Chaitin's information-theoretic incompleteness jointly imply that a purely algorithmic theory of everything is impossible, and that therefore the universe cannot be a computer simulation." She clicked to a slide summarizing their own work. "We agree with the logical results," she said. "Any recursively axiomatizable formal system rich enough to encode arithmetic is incomplete and cannot prove its own consistency. We also agree that if you demand that a single such system fully capture all physical truths, you will be disappointed." She advanced to the experimental section. "What we challenge," she continued, "is the inference from incompleteness to the impossibility of algorithmic generation of physical reality. And we bring to bear an experiment that physically implements a family of processes whose statistics approximate an omega-like sequence tied to halting problems undecidable in a given formal theory." She walked the audience through the construction, mapping Turing machines to Hamiltonians, categorizing them by provability status, measuring long-term observables, analyzing the resulting bit sequences. "When we look at category C," she said, "instances whose halting status is not settled within our chosen formalism or proof-theoretic bound, we find that the universe behaves as if it knows, answers our formal system cannot derive. The resulting sequence has algorithmic properties matching those of Chaitin's halting probability." She paused as a murmur went through the room. "One could take this," she conceded, "as evidence that physical law invokes non-algorithmic resources. But one can equally well take it as evidence that physical law corresponds to a theory stronger than any we can fully articulate from within, possibly implementable as an algorithm at a higher level. Gödel's theorem tells us there is no single computable theory that is both consistent and complete for arithmetic. It does not forbid an effectively generable structure whose internal self-descriptions are forever incomplete." She clicked to a diagram similar to the one she'd shown Tariq. Nested formal systems, an arrow labeled meta, a box labeled simulator at the top, with a question mark. "From the inside," she said, "agents like us can formalize F0, F1, F2, or L dots F0, F1, F2, and L dots, each extending the previous. We know from Gödel that for any fixed Fn, there are true statements it cannot prove. But the structure in which we live might nevertheless assign determinate truth values to all relevant physical propositions. An external algorithm, call it a simulator, could in principle generate the correct finite outcomes without ever packaging them into a single recursively enumerable axiom set. She put up her key logical slide, carefully worded. Gödel's incompleteness theorems constrain internal formal descriptions. They do not entail that no algorithmic generative process can produce all finite physical events of a universe. In our view, she said, this is the loophole. The letter's conclusion that the universe cannot be a simulation rests on an equivocation between what can be described from inside and what could be generated from outside. Paradoxically, incompleteness may be more naturally interpreted as what it feels like to be inside a simulation or any lower-level structure embedded in a richer one. She stepped back. Thank you. Tariq nodded. Thank you, Dr. Kwan. Dr. Faisal, your response? Faisal stood, adjusting his glasses. First, he said, I wish to commend Dr. Kwan and collaborators for undertaking the challenging task of making undecidability operational in a physical experiment. It is a brave and creative endeavor. Naya had to admit he meant it. However, he continued, I believe their interpretation and their loophole rests on a misunderstanding of what we meant by algorithmic theory of everything and simulation. He clicked to his own slide, showing the formal definition of FQG, FQG, FQG from the letter. We do not claim that no algorithm can ever generate finite approximations of physical reality. Of course, simulations, approximations, and models exist. Our claim is that a complete fundamental theory, capturing all physical truths, cannot be encoded as a single recursively axiomatizable system with algorithmic deduction rules. That is, there is no ultimate, purely algorithmic closure of physical law. He gestured toward May's nesting diagram. Our colleagues here introduce a hierarchy of theories F, N, F, N, F, N, and suggest that an external algorithm might, for each finite situation, consult an appropriate level, but this algorithm itself would embody a rule for choosing levels, and that rule, together with the union of the FNFN, would effectively constitute a higher-level formal system. Gödel's theorems would apply there as well. There would still be truths about the simulated universe, some tied to halting problems that this extended system could not capture. He turned slightly toward May. Thus, the incompleteness remains. Our point is not that finite segments cannot be generated by algorithms, but that there exists no algorithmic account that is both complete and self-justifying. The need for non-algorithmic understanding arises when we try to bridge that gap. He glanced at the audience. As for the simulation hypothesis, the crucial issue is not mere finite generation. It is whether a computer simulation governed entirely by recursive rules could instantiate the kind of non-algorithmic meta-level required to settle undecidable physical questions. We argue it cannot. Any such simulation as a whole would be subject to the same incompleteness constraints. It could at best mimic, but never embody, the full richness of physical truth. He bowed his head slightly. I am unconvinced that our colleague's experiment changes this. Tariq opened the floor to questions. Hands shot up. A logician in the third row spoke first. I have a question for both parties, she said. Dr. Faisal, you seem to require a sort of non-computable oracle to settle certain physical questions, Dr. Kwan. You allow for the possibility that the oracle lives outside the universe, perhaps as a simulator. But in either case, aren't you invoking something beyond Turing computation? Does the difference really matter? May answered first. It matters, she said, if one wants to conclude that the universe cannot be a simulation. If the meta-level is non-computable in an absolute sense, if it involves, say, physical hypercomputation, then perhaps it cannot be implemented on any ordinary computer. But if the meta-level is merely not capturable as a single internal formalism, while still being an effective process at some higher level, then a simulation is conceptually possible. She smiled thinly. In other words, we're arguing that Gödel forces us to accept an open-ended hierarchy of descriptions, but not necessarily an ontologically non-algorithmic substrate. A physicist near the back raised his hand. Dr. Kwan, your experiment observes an omega-like sequence. Couldn't that just be quantum randomness? After all, any random-looking sequence of sufficient length can be made to fit some omega if you're allowed to choose the underlying universal machine. May nodded. Indeed, we are cautious about overinterpreting it. Our mapping is designed so that, under reasonable assumptions, the statistics track halting behavior. But we do not claim to have bottled omega itself. The experiment is suggestive, not dispositive. Jonas thought that was an admirably restrained answer. An elderly man with a white beard stood up slowly. I have a more philosophical question, he said. Gödel showed us that no axiomatic system can fully capture arithmetic truth. But the natural numbers themselves are perfectly well defined. Might it be that reality is like that, some definite but inexhaustible structure? And if so, why should we privilege algorithmic versus non-algorithmic as an ontological distinction rather than as a limitation of our description? Faisal smiled. That is precisely why we introduced the notion of a meta-theory of everything, he said. It is not that reality is non-algorithmic in the sense of being mystical. It is that our formal tools, however powerful, remain partial. Non-algorithmic understanding is our shorthand for the ways in which human cognition, or future science, might grasp truths not yet encoded in any formalism. May responded with her own framing. I think where we diverge, she said, is in how tightly we bind that meta-level to the non-simulability claim. Our data and arguments suggest that the incompleteness of internal theories does not prohibit an algorithmic perspective at some higher level, generating the whole show. It may be turtles all the way up, but they might all be Turing-equivalent turtles. That drew a laugh. The session ran over its time slot. In the hallway afterwards, clusters formed, logicians arguing about models, physicists arguing about quantum gravity, philosophers arguing about whether the word simulation had any determinate meaning at all. Nia found herself leaning against a pillar, watching the swirl. Jonas appeared at her side. Well, he asked, have we broken reality? Hardly, Nia said. We've annoyed it a little. May approached, a thoughtful look on her face. Faisal wants to talk privately, she said, with all of us. Jonas blinked. We're being called to the principal's office. Nia felt a flutter of nerves. Let's go. 7. The meta-conversation. They met in a small side room with a view of the lake. The afternoon sun made the water shimmer. Faisal was already there, standing by the window. Up close, he looked more tired than he had on screen and more human. Thank you for agreeing to meet, he said. Thank you for engaging with our work so seriously, May replied. He gestured to the chairs. Please. They sat. For a moment, no one spoke. The hum of the conference filtered faintly through the walls. I hope you understand, Faisal said finally, that our intention in the letter was not to issue dogmatic proclamations, but to provoke fruitful discussion about the limits of formalization in physics. Jonas nodded. You have certainly succeeded. Faisal smiled. Logicians take particular delight in loopholes. I expected there would be counter-arguments. Yours is among the most interesting. Nia relaxed a little. He didn't seem angry, more curious. I am not entirely convinced, he went on, by your treatment of simulation, but I think you're correct to emphasize the distinction between internal descriptions and external generative processes. Perhaps we overstated the step from incompleteness to non-simulability. May blinked. That's unexpectedly generous. Faisal shrugged. Science is a conversation. Besides, you have made me think harder about what we mean by algorithmic at the meta-level. He looked at Nia. Your experiment worries me, though, he said. Not because of its implications for our claim, but because of what it might be tempting to read into it. You mean the glitches? Nia asked. The runs that broke when we encoded certain self-referential statements. He nodded. If you tell the world, he said, that whenever you ask the universe about its own consistency, the apparatus crashes, you will not only get physicists, you will get mystics, conspiracy theorists, and people convinced they have caught the simulation's administrator in the act. Jonas raised a hand slightly. In our defense, we haven't emphasized that part in the paper. Keep it that way, Faisal said dryly, unless you have overwhelming statistical evidence. May smiled faintly. We agree. The glitches are anecdotal, intriguing, but not yet significant. He studied her for a moment. You mentioned in your talk, he said, that one could interpret incompleteness as a kind of phenomenology of being inside a simulation. Do you believe that? She hesitated. I believe, she said slowly, that incompleteness is the phenomenology of being inside any system that tries to describe itself with tools of the same kind from which it is built. Simulation is one story about such layering. There may be others. He nodded thoughtfully. In our letter, he said, when we talk about non-algorithmic understanding, we do not necessarily posit some mystical faculty. We gesture at the ways mathematicians, for example, can see the truth of a Gödel sentence by stepping outside the system, by considering models, meta-arguments, and so on. This may itself be formalizable in a stronger system, as you emphasize, and that stronger one in a stronger still. Turtles all the way up, Jonas murmured. Yes, Faisal said, but there is an important subtlety. Each step up requires a leap, an act of insight that is not determined within the previous system. Whether that leap is algorithmic at some unreachable higher level is perhaps less important than the fact that, from within, it is experienced as going beyond rules. He tapped the table lightly. In that sense, even if the ultimate substrate is, as you say, Turing-equivalent turtles all the way up, there is a sense in which non-algorithmic understanding is real at each stage. Our letter was perhaps guilty of collapsing some of these perspectives. Your work has helpfully pried them apart. Nia found herself asking a question she hadn't known she had. Do you care, she said, personally, whether we live in a simulation? He smiled a little sadly. I care, he said, whether we can do meaningful physics. If being in a simulation precluded that, if our theories were forever thwarted by arbitrary interventions, I would be dismayed. But as long as our universe is lawful, predictable in many domains, and rich in structure, it hardly matters whether those laws arise in Platonic heaven or someone's computer. Jonas exhaled. Amen. May nodded. And our experiment, if anything, suggests that, simulation or not, the laws are deeply intertwined with the structure of computation and proof. Faisal extended a hand. Then perhaps, he said, we agree on more than we disagree. They shook. On the way out, Jonas whispered to May, did we just get the author of The Universe Cannot Be a Simulation to semi-recant? May smirked. Let's just say we nudged the priors. 8. The last run. Back at the Institute, life returned to something like normal. The meta-paper was accepted after revisions in a journal that specialized in the philosophical foundations of physics. It did not go viral, but it was cited in more technical discussions of undecidability in quantum systems and, inevitably, in online forums arguing about whether reality was a simulation. Tariq instituted a weekly seminar series titled Levels of Description, which alternated between hardcore logic, quantum gravity talks, and Nia's increasingly creative visualizations of their data. If the universe, or its hypothetical simulator, objected, it kept its objections to itself. Except once. It was almost a year after the Geneva conference when Nia found herself alone in Lab 5E late at night. May was at a workshop in Kyoto. Jonas had finally taken a vacation, hiking in Patagonia with no signal. The lab was quiet, humming softly. Nia had been meaning to clean up some old scripts. Instead, she found one labeled demo_Gödel_run.pi, a toy code she'd written months ago to illustrate their experiment for an outreach event. On impulse, she opened it, tweaked a few parameters, and pointed it at a small set of Turing machines whose associated sentences under May's mapping were self-referential in the starkest way. This statement is not provable in system FFF. Ridiculous, she muttered to herself, trying to put the liar paradox on a chip. She prepared the processor carefully. No one else was around to complain. The observables she'd defined would not tell her anything the main experiment hadn't already suggested. It was, strictly speaking, a waste of time. She ran it anyway. The job progressed normally through the first few instances. The status lights on the cryostat pulsed softly. The data streamed into the log file. Then, on the 7th instance, the console beeped. Error. Job aborted. Unexpected state in control sequence. Nia frowned. That particular message was unusual. It wasn't one of the standard hardware failure codes. It looked more like a sanity check tripped in the control software. She pulled up the logs. The last lines before the abort showed a perfectly ordinary command sequence, then a line of gibberish characters. Or not quite gibberish. Underneath the noise, there was a pattern, alternating blocks of bits, 1, 0, 1, 1, 0, 1. She copied them into a scratchpad and stared. It could be nothing. A random spill of memory, a glitch in the console font, a cosmic ray flipping a few bits, or dash dash. She sighed, shook her head, and did what she always did. She tested it. She fed the sequence into May's approximate complexity estimator. High complexity. No surprise. She compared the first 20 bits to the omega-like sequences from their earlier runs. They didn't match. She tried something dumber, interpreting the bits as ASCII. The first 8 was 0, 1, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 1. In her head, she translated 0 times 49. She laughed out loud, slightly hysterical. Okay, she said to the empty lab. Now I know I'm projecting. She turned off the console, shut down the scripts, and went home. The next morning, she checked the logs again. The line of bits was gone. Had she misremembered? Saved to a temp file that got wiped? Misread a hex dump? She shrugged it off. When May returned from Kyoto, Nia started to tell her about it, then stopped. There was no data, no reproducible effect, just a late-night impression. Instead, she said, "We should clean up those outreach scripts. They're a mess." May agreed. Life went on. 9 different conclusions. Months later, in a recorded panel discussion for an online series about the future of fundamental physics, Nia found herself summarized, lightly and inevitably imprecisely, by a moderator. So, the moderator said, to wrap up, Dr. Kwan, Dr. Santos, you argued that Gödel's incompleteness theorems and related results, far from proving that our universe is not a simulation, may simply reflect the limitations of any internal theory we can form. In fact, they may be exactly what we expect if we are part of a larger, perhaps algorithmically generable structure. Is that fair? May, on the split screen, nodded. Fair, she said. Though I'd phrase it more cautiously, we showed that the specific inference in one paper, from incompleteness to non-simulability, is not logically forced. Gödel constrains internal descriptions, not necessarily external generators. Whether we live in a simulation remains, in our view, empirically underdetermined. And Dr. Faisal, the moderator said, turning to another window, having heard and engaged with their work, do you still hold that the universe cannot be a simulation? Faisal smiled. I would now say, he replied, that if one defines simulation narrowly as a purely algorithmic process that fully captures and justifies all truths about its own behavior, then no, such a thing cannot exist, for reasons Gödel makes clear. But if one allows for an open-ended hierarchy of descriptions, with meta-levels that are never fully internalized, then the line between simulation and reality becomes blurred. He glanced almost conspiratorially toward May's video window. In that broader sense, he said, I am less inclined to issue categorical statements. The moderator chuckled. That is as close to a walkback as one can expect in theoretical physics. Jonas, from his own window, leaned in. I think the deeper lesson, he said, is not about simulation per se, but about humility. Gödel, Tarski, Chaitin, They all tell us there is no final closed theory that says everything there is to say. There will always be truths our current formalisms can't capture. Whether you interpret those as signs of a non-computable substrate, or of being inside an ever-richer hierarchy of algorithms, or of something else entirely, they all point to the same thing. There is always more. Nia added, and our little experiment suggests that more isn't just a philosophical idea. It shows up in the behavior of quantum systems, in the way physical processes can mirror uncomputable patterns that doesn't decide the metaphysical question. But it does mean that undecidability in physics is not just a metaphor. It's a frontier we can, at least partially, explore. The moderator nodded. So perhaps the real mystery is not whether we are in a simulation, but how deep the ladder of theories goes, and whether we'll ever stop trying to climb it. Later, walking home under a clear night sky, Nia looked up. The stars were crisp, the constellations arranged in familiar patterns, photons streaming from impossibly distant fusion furnaces, red-shifted, lensed, scattered, finally ending their journey on her retinas. Somewhere perhaps a program ticked, or not. In either case, she thought as she shoved her hands into her pockets against the chill, the mystery remained, a universe whose truths outran any finite description, yet which let creatures like her and May and Jonas and Mia poke at its edges with math and machines. Gödel had once been read by some as a kind of doom. There is no complete system. To Nia now, it sounded almost like an invitation. Not a proof that the universe was or wasn't a simulation, but a promise that, whichever way it went, there would always be another question to ask, another level to glimpse, another loophole to find. She smiled to herself. Fine, she said quietly, to the sky, to the possible simulator, to the unending tower of theories. Let the games begin.